My boss stood there on the pristine white sand, martini in hand, looking at me like I was dirt on his Italian loafers. "You're nothing without this job," he said, loud enough for half the executive team to hear. The waves crashed behind us, the sunset painting the sky orange and pink, and something inside me just snapped. I smiled, handed him my resort key card, and said, "Watch me." What he didn't know was that I'd been secretly working on something for months. What he definitely didn't know was that by the end of that week, I'd own a piece of the very resort we were standing on. This is the story of how my boss's biggest mistake became my greatest victory. I need to take you back 6 months before that beach confrontation to really understand how sweet this revenge tasted. My name is Marcus, and I've been working as a senior financial analyst at Hartman Capital Group for almost 7 years. 7 years of 80-hour weeks, missed birthdays, canceled vacations, and sacrificing everything for a company that saw me as nothing more than a replaceable cog in their wealth-generating machine. My boss, Richard Hartman, was the kind of man who wore his cruelty like a badge of honor. He was the son of the company's founder, born with a silver spoon so far down his throat that he could barely see the rest of us as human beings. Richard had this way of managing people that was straight out of some dystopian nightmare. He'd pit us against each other constantly, dangling promotions like carrots in front of starving rabbits, only to give them to his golf buddies or whoever laughed loudest at his inappropriate jokes. He'd call emergency meetings at 9 p.m. on Friday nights just because he could. He'd send emails at 3 in the morning with the subject line, "Urgent," only to ask about something that could have waited until Monday. The man didn't just cross boundaries. He demolished them and then charged you rent for the rubble. But here's the thing about working in finance, especially at a boutique firm like Hartman Capital. You learn things. You see deals. You understand how money flows, where opportunities hide, and most importantly, you develop a network. While Richard thought I was just another pencil pusher running his numbers and making his presentations look pretty, I was actually paying attention to everything. Every deal that crossed my desk taught me something. Every client meeting I sat in on was a masterclass in negotiation. Every financial model I built added another tool to my arsenal. About 8 months before the beach incident, I started noticing something interesting in our deal flow. We were advising on the sale of a boutique resort collection called Azure Coast Properties. 3 stunning properties, one in the Florida Keys, one in Monterey, and one in the Outer Banks. The portfolio was being sold by an aging couple who'd built their dream over 40 years, and they were looking to retire. The asking price was $42 million, which sounds like an impossible sum until you break down the numbers like I did. Each property generated consistent revenue. The occupancy rates were incredible, averaging 85% year-round. The couple had loyal staff who'd been there for decades, meaning low turnover costs. The properties themselves were immaculate, requiring minimal capital expenditure. And here's the kicker: they were valued conservatively. Based on comparable sales in those markets and the revenue multiples, these properties were worth at least $55 to $60 million, maybe more with the right management improvements. Our firm was representing the sellers, but Richard, in his infinite arrogance, had decided the deal wasn't prestigious enough for our portfolio. Beach motels, he'd call them in a partners meeting, waving his hand dismissively. Let's focus on the real estate deals that matter. Manhattan high-rises, not some mom-and-pop vacation spots. The other partners had nodded along like bobbleheads, afraid to contradict the boss's son. But I saw what they didn't: opportunity. I started doing research on my own time. I'd go home after those brutal days at the office, and instead of collapsing in a bed like my body begged me to, I'd pull out my laptop and dig deeper. I analyzed every financial statement from the past decade. I studied tourism trends in those markets. I read reviews from guests. I looked at aerial photos and zoning regulations. I even took a weekend trip down to the Florida Keys property, told them I was a potential guest, and spent 2 days there just observing everything. What I found was even better than I'd hoped. The couple running these properties, Edward and Martha Chun, were incredible people who'd built something special, but they were tired and ready to pass the torch. Their children had gone into other careers and weren't interested in taking over. They needed someone who understood the business, who would respect what they'd built, and who had the financial backing to close quickly. They weren't just looking for the highest bidder. They wanted the right buyer. That's when the idea started forming. What if I could put together a deal? Not just me, obviously. I didn't have $42 million lying around in my checking account. But what if I could structure something? I had 7 years of relationships with high-net-worth individuals who'd come through our firm. I'd helped dozens of them make millions on various deals. I knew who had money sitting in low-yield investments looking for better opportunities. I knew who was interested in hospitality real estate. I knew who trusted my analysis. I spent the next 3 months of my life living a double existence. By day, I was Marcus, the senior analyst, running numbers for Richard's deals, nodding along in meetings, playing the good corporate soldier. By night and on weekends, I was Marcus, the entrepreneur, quietly putting together the deal of a lifetime. I started reaching out to contacts very carefully and very discreetly. I'd schedule coffee meetings before work or lunch meetings away from the office. I'd have phone calls from my car in the parking garage. Everything had to be kept completely separate from Hartman Capital because I knew if Richard got even a whiff of what I was doing, he'd either try to steal the deal or torpedo it out of spite. The structure I proposed was actually pretty elegant. I'd form an LLC where I'd be the managing member with a 20% ownership stake despite only putting up 2% of the capital. The rest would come from 5 limited partner investors who'd each put in roughly $8 million. My sweat equity, my deal sourcing, and my operational management would justify my larger stake. I'd also take a modest salary as the managing director of the properties. The investors would get preferred returns of 8% annually before profits were split, which was attractive given the stable cash flow these properties generated. The pitch was straightforward. These were trophy assets in prime locations, operating well below their potential, with an experienced financial analyst who'd spent 7 years in the industry ready to optimize operations. I projected we could increase revenues by 20% within 2 years through modest improvements, better online marketing, dynamic pricing strategies, upgraded amenities, and partnerships with local tourism boards. The properties could realistically be worth $70 million within 5 years, giving investors a substantial multiple on their money. The first person I pitched was Daniel Kwan, a tech entrepreneur who'd sold his company for $200 million 3 years earlier. I'd worked on the financial due diligence for that sale, and we'd stayed in touch. He loved the hospitality sector and had been looking for exactly this kind of opportunity. He committed $8 million after just 2 meetings. That first yes was like oxygen to a drowning man. It made everything feel possible. The second investor was Patricia Goldstein, a retired pharmaceutical executive who'd made a fortune and was now focused on lifestyle investments. She told me once over drinks after a client dinner that she wished she owned a beautiful place by the ocean. Well, now she could own a piece of 3 of them. She was in for $8 million. The third investor took longer to convince. Marcus Thibodeau was old money from Louisiana, extremely conservative with his investments, but he trusted my analysis. I must have redone the financial projections 15 times based on his questions. He stressed every assumption, poked holes in every argument, and made me defend every number. But in the end, his rigorous process made the deal stronger, and he committed his $8 million. The fourth investor was actually a couple, Stephen and Jennifer Park, who'd built a successful chain of Korean barbecue restaurants and were looking to diversify. They loved the idea of hospitality real estate and saw synergies with their restaurant expertise. They came in for $8 million and brought valuable operational insights about food and beverage, which was the weakest performing segment at the resorts. The fifth investor was the hardest to secure, Harrison Blackwell, a hedge fund manager with more money than God and an ego to match. He was notoriously difficult, demanding, and skeptical of everything. But he was also brilliant, and if I could get him on board, his involvement would validate the entire deal. I pitched him 7 times over 2 months. 7 times. He'd find something he didn't like, and I'd have to go back and rework it. But finally, on that 7th meeting, he leaned back in his chair in his corner office overlooking Central Park and said, "Fine, I'm in for $10 million, but I want an extra 2% of the equity." I countered with 1%, and we settled at 1.5. Done. I had my $40 million in investor commitments. I'd personally scraped together about $900,000, which was essentially every penny I'd saved over 7 years, plus a loan against my 401k, plus a personal loan from my parents who mortgaged their house to help me. I know that sounds insane, and it was insane, but I believed in this deal with every fiber of my being. My ownership stake would be about 18.5% when everything was finalized, and I'd be the managing member with full operational control. The due diligence process was intense. We had to verify everything: structural inspections of all the buildings, environmental assessments, reviewing every contract with every vendor and employee, confirming the financial statements, examining the property titles, ensuring all permits and licenses were current. I coordinated all of this while still working my full-time job at Hartman Capital, which meant I was basically functioning on 4 hours of sleep a night for 3 solid months. I lost 15 pounds. My girlfriend at the time left me because I'd become, in her words, a zombie who only talks about beach resorts. My friends stopped inviting me out because I always canceled at the last minute. But it was all coming together. The Chins were wonderful to work with. They genuinely wanted to see their legacy continue, and they could tell I cared about these properties as more than just investment vehicles. We negotiated a purchase price of $41 million, which was slightly below asking because I convinced them that we'd close quickly with all cash and no financing contingencies. By late spring, we were about 2 weeks away from closing. That's when Hartman Capital announced the annual executive retreat. Every year, Richard would pick some luxurious location and drag the senior team there for 3 days of what he called strategic planning, but what was really just an excuse for him to play golf, drink expensive wine, and remind everyone that he was in charge. This year, he'd chosen a resort in the Outer Banks. When I saw the name of the resort in the email invitation, my blood ran cold. Azure Coast Outer Banks. He'd picked one of the properties I was about to buy. I had no choice but to go. Missing the executive retreat would have been career suicide and would have raised suspicions right when I needed to stay under the radar for just 2 more weeks. So I booked my flight, packed my bags, and prepared for the most surreal weekend of my life. I was going to spend 3 days at a property I was secretly buying while pretending to be Richard's loyal employee. The closing was scheduled for the following Friday. I just had to hold it together for a few more days. The resort was even more beautiful than I'd remembered from my earlier visits. The main building was a restored 1920s beach house with wraparound porches and views of the Atlantic that took your breath away. The guest cottages were scattered across the property, each with its own character and charm. The staff greeted us warmly, and I recognized several of them from the employee lists I'd reviewed during due diligence. These would soon be my employees, though they had no idea who I was. The first day and a half of the retreat were tolerable. We had meetings during the day where Richard pontificated about market trends he barely understood while the rest of us nodded and took notes. In the evenings, we'd have dinners where he'd hold court, telling the same stories about his father building the business, about his golf handicap, about his connections with politicians and celebrities. I smiled and laughed at the appropriate moments and counted down the hours until I could leave. Then came that Friday evening, our last night at the resort. Richard had arranged for a beach bonfire for the team. The sun was setting, painting the sky in those brilliant oranges and pinks that the Outer Banks is famous for. Someone had set up a bar on the sand, and a catering team was grilling fresh seafood. It should have been pleasant, maybe even beautiful, if it weren't for Richard's presence poisoning everything. I was standing near the water, finally having a moment to myself, when Richard approached with that predatory smile he got when he was about to make someone's life miserable. He was already a few drinks in, his face flushed, his tie loosened. "Marcus," he called out, loud enough to make several people turn and look. "Come here, I want to talk to you." I walked over, my stomach tightening. "What's up, Richard?" I've been thinking about your performance lately," he said, and I could tell from his tone that nothing good was coming next. "You've been distracted, unfocused, not putting in the hours like you used to. I'm starting to wonder if you still have what it takes to be successful at this firm." Several of my colleagues were within earshot now, pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. This was Richard's favorite tactic: Public humiliation disguised as mentorship. I've been working on a Morrison deal, the restructuring for I started, but he cut me off with a wave of his hand. I don't want to hear excuses. You know what your problem is, Marcus? You think you're smarter than you are. You think you've got some kind of special insight that the rest of us don't have. But here's the reality. He stepped closer, and I could smell the whiskey on his breath. You're nothing without this job. Without Hartman Capital, without the opportunities I've given you. You're just another MBA graduate drowning in student debt. This firm is the only reason you can afford your apartment, your car, your lifestyle. You should be grateful every single day that we took a chance on you. And lately, I'm not seeing that gratitude. The beach had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now. This was the moment Richard lived for. Absolute power over someone else's dignity. I could see it in his eyes, that gleeful cruelty. He wanted me to apologize, to grovel, to thank him for his wisdom and promise to do better. He wanted to reassert the hierarchy in front of everyone. But something was different this time. Maybe it was because I knew that in exactly 1 week, I'd close on a $41 million deal that would change my life forever. Maybe it was because I was standing on a property I was about to own. Maybe it was just 7 years of accumulated resentment finally reaching critical mass. Whatever it was, I felt this strange calm wash over me. I smiled at Richard. A real smile, not the fake corporate smile I'd been giving him for 7 years. You're absolutely right, I said quietly. He blinked, surprised. This wasn't the script. What? You're right. I am nothing without this job. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet, removing my Hartman Capital key card and my corporate credit card. So I guess it's time to find out who I really am. I held them out to him. Richard stared at the cards like they were snakes. What are you doing? I'm resigning, Richard. Effective immediately. I quit. I pressed the cards into his hand. Thank you for the opportunity to work at Hartman Capital. It taught me everything I needed to know about what kind of businessman I want to be, which is nothing like you. His face went from flush to deep red, the color of a ripe tomato about to burst. You can't be serious. You're throwing away your career over what? Hurt feelings? Grow up, Marcus. Where are you going to go? Who's going to hire you after you storm off a company retreat? I don't need anyone to hire me, I said, and the words felt electric coming out of my mouth. I'm done working for people like you. I'm done pretending that your tantrums are leadership and your cruelty is motivation. I'm done sacrificing my life for a company that sees me as disposable. I looked around at my colleagues, some of whom were watching with barely concealed admiration, others with horror. And honestly, Richard, I feel sorry for all of you who stay. You all deserve better than this. I turned and started walking up the beach toward the resort. Behind me, I could hear Richard sputtering, trying to regain control of the situation. You walk away now, and you're finished. You hear me? Finished. I'll make sure no one in this industry hires you. You'll be blacklisted. You're nothing. I didn't turn around. I just raised my hand in a wave and kept walking. When I got to my cottage, I packed my bag, called a car to take me to the airport, and booked the next flight out. I was gone within 2 hours, and I've never felt more free in my entire life. The following week was chaos. My phone blew up with calls and texts from colleagues at Hartman Capital, some offering support, others asking if I'd lost my mind. Richard apparently spent the rest of the retreat telling everyone who'd listened that I'd had some kind of breakdown and that I'd come crawling back within a month. He was already spinning the narrative, protecting his ego. But I wasn't paying attention to any of that because I was focused on the only thing that mattered, closing the deal. That Friday, exactly 1 week after I quit, I sat in a conference room with the Chins, all 5 of my investors, a team of lawyers, and a pile of documents 3 inches thick. We spent 6 hours going through every page, every signature, every initial. The wire transfers were confirmed. The titles were transferred. And at 4:37 p.m., Edward Chin shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, Marcus. Take care of our baby." I owned 18.5% of $41 million in prime beachfront hospitality real estate, and I was the managing member with full operational control of all 3 properties. At age 32, I'd just gone from employee to entrepreneur, from analyst to owner, from taking orders to giving them. The math was simple. My stake was worth approximately $7.5 million on paper, and that number would only grow as we improved operations and the properties appreciated. The first thing I did after closing was drive straight to the Azure Coast Outer Banks property. The same resort where Richard had humiliated me just 1 week earlier was now partially mine. I pulled into the parking lot at sunset, and Martha Chun was waiting for me on the front porch. She'd insisted on being there for my first visit as the new owner, even though they'd technically transferred everything that afternoon. "Welcome home," she said, handing me a set of master keys. Those 2 words hit me harder than I expected, and I had to blink back tears. We walked the property together as the sky turned purple and gold. Martha told me stories about guests who'd been coming for 30 years, about staff members who felt like family, about storms they'd weathered and celebrations they'd hosted. "You're going to do wonderful things with this place," she said as we stood on the beach, watching the waves. "I can feel it. Edward and I prayed for the right person to take over, and I believe you're the answer to that prayer." I promised her I wouldn't let her down, and I meant it with everything in me. The next 3 months were the most intense professional experience of my life, and I'd worked some brutal stretches at Hartman Capital, so that's saying something. I essentially lived between the 3 properties, spending a week or 2 at each location, learning every aspect of the operations. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to review the previous day's numbers, then spend the morning meeting with department heads, the afternoon working on strategic initiatives, and the evenings walking the properties and talking with guests and staff. The staff was understandably nervous at first. New ownership always creates anxiety, and they'd heard rumors that some corporate investor group was taking over. When I showed up, this young guy in jeans and a polo shirt who wanted to learn everyone's name and hear their ideas, they didn't quite know what to make of me. But I learned from watching the Chins that hospitality is fundamentally about people, both the guests you serve and the team you build. I made it clear from day one that I wasn't there to slash costs and maximize short-term profits. I was there to build something sustainable and special. One of my first major decisions was to give every employee who'd been there more than 5 years a retention bonus and a raise. It cost us about $280,000 across all 3 properties, and my investors nearly had a heart attack when I proposed it. Harrison Blackwell, the hedge fund guy, actually flew down to the Florida Keys to confront me in person. "We're here to make money, not run a charity," he said, standing in my temporary office with his arms crossed. "We're here to build a business that lasts," I countered. "And that starts with the people who actually run these properties every single day. The housekeepers who make sure every room is perfect. The front desk staff who handle guest complaints at 2 in the morning. The maintenance crew who keep everything running. They're the business, Harrison. They're what makes guests come back year after year. We lose them, we lose everything. Besides, happy employees create happy guests, and happy guests spend more money and leave better reviews. This isn't charity, it's strategy." He glared at me for a long moment, then suddenly laughed. "You know what? You got guts, kid. Fine. But those numbers better improve like you promised." He left, and I exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. The staff retention strategy paid off almost immediately. Word spread that the new ownership actually cared about them, and the energy across all 3 properties shifted. People started bringing me ideas for improvements. The head chef at the Outer Banks location suggested we start a farm-to-table dinner series featuring local ingredients. The activities coordinator in the Keys proposed partnership with a marine conservation group for educational snorkeling tours. The front desk manager in Monterey had ideas for packages targeting the Bay Area tech crowd who needed weekend escapes. I said yes to almost everything, and I gave people budgets and authority to execute their visions. The farm-to-table dinners became our highest-margin food and beverage offering and started getting written up in regional food magazines. The conservation snorkeling tours attracted a younger, more affluent demographic that spent more on accommodations and extras. The Monterey Tech packages filled our weekday occupancy gaps with high-value customers who also started using us for corporate retreats. Within 6 months, our revenue was up 17% across the portfolio, way ahead of my projections. But more importantly, our guest satisfaction scores had improved dramatically. We were getting 5-star reviews at a rate we'd never seen before. Travel bloggers and Instagram influencers started discovering us. The properties were developing a buzz, a reputation as these hidden gems that offered something different from the corporate hotel chains. I was also learning that I actually love this work in a way I'd never loved finance. There is something deeply satisfying about creating experiences for people, about building a team, about seeing tangible results from your decisions. When a family would check out and tell me their stay was the best vacation they'd ever had, that hit different than closing a deal that made rich people richer. Don't get me wrong, I love that my investors were happy and that my ownership stake was increasing in value, but the day-to-day satisfaction came from somewhere else entirely. I'd been so busy that I'd barely thought about Hartman Capital or Richard until about 8 months after I left. That's when I got a text from Jennifer Lee, one of my former colleagues who I'd actually been friends with. "Have you seen the news about Hartman?" she asked. I hadn't, so I Googled it, and there it was, Hartman Capital Group under investigation for securities violations. Apparently, the SEC had opened an investigation into several of their deals, including some I'd worked on. There were allegations of misleading investors about risk factors and potentially cooking the books on some valuations. I felt sick reading it, not because I was implicated. I'd been very careful to document everything and I'd left before any of the worst stuff happened, but because it confirmed everything I'd suspected about how Richard operated. He'd always pushed ethical boundaries, always prioritized appearances over substance, always believed the rules didn't apply to him. Jennifer told me that several partners had resigned, clients were fleeing, and Richard was lawyering up. The firm I'd spent 7 years building might not survive. Part of me felt vindicated. Richard had told me I was nothing without that job, and here I was thriving while his empire crumbled. But mostly I just felt relieved that I'd gotten out when I did. If I'd stayed, I could have been caught up in that investigation, could have had my reputation destroyed through association, could have spent years and thousands of dollars on legal fees defending myself. My instinct to leave had been right in more ways than I'd even realized. Around the same time, something else interesting happened. I got an email from the Coastal Hospitality Association asking if I'd be interested in speaking at their annual conference about my first year of property ownership. Apparently, people in the industry had heard about this young guy who'd bought 3 properties and was implementing some innovative strategies. I accepted, partly because it seemed like good networking, partly because I figured I should start building a reputation beyond just being that guy who quit at a beach bonfire. The conference was in Miami, and I was scheduled to speak on a panel about emerging trends in boutique hospitality. I prepared extensively, pulling together data on all our initiatives, their costs, and their returns. I want to make a case that you could run these properties profitably while still treating staff well and delivering exceptional guest experiences. That it wasn't a zero-sum game between stakeholder returns and quality. The panel went really well. The room was packed, and people asked thoughtful questions. Afterward, I had a line of people wanting to exchange business cards and pick my brain about various aspects of our operations. It was energizing and exhausting in equal measure. I was talking to a developer from Charleston about our marketing strategies when someone said behind me, "Well, if it isn't the great Marcus Chun." I turned around, and there was Richard Hartman. He looked terrible. He'd lost weight. His suit didn't fit quite right anymore, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But his expression was the same, that mix of arrogance and barely concealed anger that I'd seen so many times before. "Richard," I said evenly, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I bet you didn't," he said, stepping closer. "I've been hearing a lot about you lately. The wonder boy who struck out on his own. Very inspiring story you told up there. You left out the part where you were planning this while you were still working for me, though. That feels like relevant context." Several people nearby had stopped their conversations and were watching us now. I kept my voice calm and professional. I didn't violate any non-compete agreements or take any proprietary information from Hartman Capital. Everything I did was completely above board, which is more than can be said for some people. His face flushed red. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you won something? Let me tell you what you've got. 3 small properties in a dying industry. Meanwhile, people with real ambition are doing actual deals in markets that matter. You've chosen small-time mediocrity. Marcus, you could have been somebody if you'd stayed and learned from me. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd made my life miserable for 7 years, who'd told me I was nothing, who I'd spent so much energy being angry at. And I realized I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt nothing, or maybe pity. Richard, I have 40 employees across 3 properties who are earning good wages and building careers. I have investors who are seeing excellent returns on their capital. I have hundreds of guests who are creating memories with their families. I have a business that's growing sustainably and ethically. And I wake up every single morning excited about what I'm building. I paused. That's not mediocrity. That's success. And I learned from you, just not the lessons you think you were teaching. I turned to walk away, but he grabbed my arm. You think you're better than me? His voice was rising now, and several conference staff members were starting to move in our direction. You're nothing but a jumped-up analyst who got lucky. You'll fail within 2 years, and when you do, don't come crawling back looking for a job reference. I gently remove his hand from my arm. I don't think I'm better than you, Richard. I just think I'm happier. And I hope someday you figure out whatever it is you're really angry about, because it's clearly not me. I walked away, and this time he didn't follow. That night, back in my hotel room, I got a text from Daniel Kwan, my first investor. Heard about your run-in with your old boss at the conference. Someone videoed part of it, and it's making the rounds. You handled it with serious class. Proud to be in business with you. Other investors and colleagues sent similar messages. Apparently, Richard's meltdown had been witnessed by enough people that it was becoming a story in industry circles, and not a story that reflected well on him. I didn't take any pleasure in his humiliation. I'd learned that revenge, even when it feels justified, is ultimately empty. What mattered was that I'd built something real, something I could be proud of. Richard's opinion of me, his anger at my success, his need to tear me down, none of that could touch what I'd actually accomplished. The business continued to grow through year 2 and into year 3. We expanded our marketing into international markets and started getting guests from Europe and Asia. We upgraded some of the amenities while maintaining the property's authentic charm. We started a loyalty program that created repeat visitors. By the end of year 3, our portfolio was valued at approximately $68 million, and we were generating enough cash flow to give investors their 8% preferred return plus profit distributions. My 18.5% stake was now worth approximately $12.5 million on paper, and I was earning a salary of $250,000 annually as managing director. I'd gone from a guy with less than $1 million in net worth and a high-stress job working for a tyrant to a millionaire entrepreneur running a growing business that I actually loved. More importantly, I'd proven something to myself, that I didn't need Richard or Hartman Capital or anyone else to validate my worth. The properties themselves had become something special. We developed a real culture across all 3 locations, where staff members felt ownership in what we were building. We created spaces where families came back year after year, where couples got engaged on our beaches, where people celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and life milestones. We were in the memory-making business, and we were damn good at it. I also started getting approached by other property owners who were interested in selling to us. We acquired a 4th property in Hilton Head during year 4, expanding the portfolio and giving us even more geographic diversity. My investors were thrilled, and we started discussing plans for eventually taking the company public or selling to a larger hospitality group. But I wasn't in a rush. I was enjoying the journey too much. One afternoon during year 5, I was at the Outer Banks property, the same beach where Richard had told me I was nothing. I was sitting on the porch of what had been my cottage during that horrible executive retreat, watching the sunset, thinking about how much had changed. My phone rang, and it was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Marcus? It's Edward Chun. I smiled immediately. Edward and Martha had been traveling the world in retirement, but they checked in regularly to see how their baby was doing. Edward, how are you? Where are you calling from? We're in Bali, having the time of our lives. But Martha and I were just talking, and we wanted to tell you something. He paused. I could hear the emotion in his voice. We've been coming back to visit the properties occasionally, just to check in from afar. And Marcus, What you've done is beyond anything we could have hoped for. You've honored what we built, but you've also made it your own. You made it better. And the staff, they talk about you the way they used to talk about us. Like family. We just wanted you to know that we're grateful we found you. You were the right person. I had to clear my throat before I could respond. Thank you, Edward. That means everything to me. Truly. I think about you and Martha every day, about the legacy you built and trusted me with. I don't take it lightly. We know you don't. That's why it worked. We talked for a few more minutes about his travels and some updates on the properties. And then he said something that stuck with me. You know what the secret is, Marcus? To all of this? It's caring about something beyond just the money. The money is important, don't get me wrong. But when you care about the people and the place and the experience you're creating, the money follows. You figure that out. Not everyone does. After we hung up, I sat there watching the waves crash against the shore as the sky turned from orange to pink to purple. I thought about Richard telling me I was nothing without my job at Hartman Capital. I thought about the terror I'd felt risking everything on this deal. I thought about the 80-hour weeks and the stress and the moments when I'd wondered if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. And then I thought about where I was now, financially secure, running a business I loved, surrounded by people I respected, creating something meaningful. Richard had been wrong about almost everything, but he'd been accidentally right about one thing. I was nothing without that job. Nothing like the person he wanted me to be. Nothing like the type of businessman he represented. Nothing like the version of success he valued. And that nothingness had become everything. By refusing to be what he wanted, I discovered who I actually was. The sunset finished, and the stars started appearing. I had an early meeting tomorrow with the architect who was helping us plan the renovation of some cottages. I had a call with investors to review Q3 numbers. I had 100 things on my to-do list. But right then, in that moment, I just sat there on that porch and felt grateful. Grateful for the courage to walk away. Grateful for the people who'd believed in me. Grateful for the opportunity to prove that there was a better way to do business. Someone once told me that the best revenge is success, but I don't think that's quite right. Revenge implies you're still thinking about the other person, still giving them power over your story. The best thing I've learned is building something so meaningful and so aligned with your values that you forget why you were angry in the first place. You don't win by beating the people who doubted you. You win by becoming the person you were always meant to be. Richard had tried to define me by my relationship to him, to his company, to the job he'd given me. He'd wanted me to believe that without his validation, I was worthless, but he'd given me something valuable without meaning to. He'd shown me exactly what I didn't want to become. Every decision I made as a business owner was filtered through one question. What would Richard do? And then I'd do the opposite. Treat people with dignity instead of contempt. Build sustainable value instead of chasing short-term gains. Care about the work itself instead of just the status it brings. Led with humility instead of arrogance. 5 years after that beach confrontation, I'm running a $70 million hospitality company with over 100 employees across 4 properties. I'm 37 years old, financially secure, and genuinely happy with the life I've built. Richard, from what I hear, is still dealing with the aftermath of that SEC investigation. Hartman Capital survived, but is a shadow of what it was, and Richard himself has largely withdrawn from the industry. I don't feel victorious about that. I don't feel much of anything about Richard anymore, which is perhaps the strangest outcome of all. The man who once had so much power over my emotional state is now just a character in a story I sometimes tell, a cautionary tale about what happens when you confuse cruelty with strength. The real victory isn't that I succeeded after he said I'd fail. It's that I built something that reflects my values, that I created opportunities for others, that I took a huge risk, and it paid off not just financially, but in every way that actually matters. It's that I wake up excited instead of dreading the day. It's that I've proven to myself that I can do this, that I have what it takes, that my worth isn't determined by someone else's assessment. If I could go back and talk to myself on that beach 5 years ago, my hands shaking as I handed Richard my corporate cards, I'd tell myself this: you're about to be scared. You're going to question this decision 1,000 times over the next few months. You're going to have moments where you wonder if you made a catastrophic mistake. But stay the course. Trust yourself. Trust the work you've done. Trust that there's a version of success that has nothing to do with impressing people like Richard and everything to do with building something authentic. It's going to work out better than you can imagine. So to anyone reading this story who's sitting in a job where someone is telling you that you're nothing without them, where you're being mistreated and undervalued, where you've got an idea or a dream but you're too scared to pursue it, I want you to know something. You're not nothing. You're never nothing. Your worth isn't determined by your job title or your salary or whether some insecure boss validates you. Your worth is intrinsic. It's about what you build, how you treat people, whether you're moving toward or away from the person you want to be. Taking that leap is terrifying. I won't lie about that. There were nights I couldn't sleep, mornings I felt physically sick with anxiety, moments I almost gave up. But the regret of not trying would have been so much worse than the fear of failure. And here's what I learned. When you're building something you actually believe in, the fear doesn't go away, but it becomes fuel. It sharpens your focus. It makes you work harder. It reminds you what's at stake. Not everyone's story will look like mine. Not everyone has the opportunity or resources to buy a resort or start a company. But everyone has the capacity to decide who they want to be and to start moving in that direction, one decision at a time. Maybe it's going back to school. Maybe it's starting a side hustle. Maybe it's just setting better boundaries at your current job. Maybe it's finally pursuing that creative project you've been thinking about for years. Whatever it is, I promise you it's worth it. Because here's what I know now that I didn't know 5 years ago. The people who try to make you feel small do it because they feel small themselves. They need you to believe you're nothing without them, because deep down they're terrified you'll figure out that you're everything without them. Richard needed me to stay small because my ambition and independence threatened his sense of control. My success doesn't diminish him, but he believes it does, which is the real tragedy. So thank you for reading my story. I hope it inspires you to take whatever leap you've been contemplating. I hope it reminds you that your current circumstances don't determine your potential. I hope it shows you that building something meaningful is possible especially when other people tell you it isn't. And I hope you remember that the best response to someone who says, "You're nothing without this," is to go out and build something that proves they were never the point at all. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment where someone doubted you and you proved them wrong? Are you currently in a situation where you're contemplating taking a big risk? Share your story. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you found value in this, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more real stories about taking risks and building something meaningful, and share this with someone who needs to hear that they're capable of more than they think. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Until next time, remember, you're not nothing. You're everything. You just have to believe enough to act on it.